Bom dia a todos. Sou Eduarda Hamann, sou coordenadora da Rede Brasileira de Pesquisa sobre Operações de Paz, e é uma honra, mais uma vez, mais um dia de evento anual nosso, estar aqui com vocês. Estou falando diretamente do Planalto Central. Estou aqui na Universidade de Brasília com o professor Alcides Costa Vaz, que é parceiro da REBRAPAZ há cerca de 1 ano e meio, e hoje, como ontem, esse evento da REBRAPAZ está sendo hospedado pela Universidade de Brasília. Só para dar um pouquinho, antes de passar a palavra para o professor Alcides, só para dar um pouquinho de contextualização sobre a REBRAPAZ, para quem está conhecendo o nosso trabalho agora. A rede foi criada em 2016, e desde 2017 a gente tem oferecido para a sociedade, né, esse tipo de encontro, esse tipo de evento. É um evento gratuito, é um evento em que todos os envolvidos são voluntários. Nós temos civis, militares e policiais. Os civis envolvidos são acadêmicos ou pessoas que trabalham na própria ONU, que têm experiência de ONU, quer dizer, practitioners, militares das 3 Forças Armadas. Então, assim, de fato, a gente juntou um grupo bom de pessoas na rede e também nos eventos, de maneira a contribuir para as operações de paz da ONU e para esse debate, né, essa reflexão sobre operações de paz, ajudar na tomada de decisão aqui no Brasil, sobre, né, para onde vamos, o que fazemos com relação às operações de paz. Né? Não me canso de afirmar que essa é uma iniciativa inédita aqui no Brasil, e me dá muito orgulho fazer parte disso, coordenar, enfim, liderar esses esforços com apoio de toda a equipe do GEPS, esse ano em particular, e da própria REBRAPAZ, né? O tema do evento de hoje e ontem, esse ano, o tema é a fragilidade e o futuro das operações de paz diante das recentes mudanças na ordem global. Então, a gente está falando de um mundo pós-pandemia, um mundo, guerra na Rússia, naturalmente, corrida armamentista, crise energética. É um tema que muito nos inquieta, inquieta nós, né, analistas, especialistas. Nós trabalhamos com segurança internacional e com operações de paz especificamente, porque alguns estados mais poderosos estão dando sinais claros de que ferramentas multilaterais não são mais tão relevantes para resolver problemas de paz e segurança internacional. Então, isso nos inquieta, né? Qual é a relevância de uma ferramenta como as operações de paz nesse tipo de contexto? Quais são os impactos que isso tem e vai ter, mais ainda, no orçamento que tem sido cada vez menor para as operações de paz, e, em última instância, quais os impactos que isso vai ter na própria efetividade do que se faz no terreno, né? no próprio cumprimento dos mandatos que são negociados e que vão, em última instância, ajudar os países a fazer essa transição, né, do espaço de conflito para um espaço um pouco mais estável. Então, isso é muito relevante para nós, analistas, e é uma honra, volto a dizer, para a REBRAPAZ, para mim em particular, oferecer para a nossa sociedade um programa como esse, que está sendo costurado, trabalhado desde o final de julho. Então, a gente está há alguns meses costurando esse programa para trazer para vocês, de fato, o topo da onda, né, da crista da onda aí do que se tem falado e pensado sobre operações de paz. Esse segundo dia é mais pesado do que o dia anterior, do que ontem, é mais complexo também, é um dia em que nós trazemos especialistas em diversos temas para conversar com vocês. Nós temos pessoas que vão falar conosco de Nova York, da África do Sul, do Sudão, Sudão do Sul, Colômbia, do Brasil também. Então, temos assim uma diversidade muito bacana de brasileiros e também de sul-africano. O Cedric que está aqui conosco, sul-africano, vai falar conosco da África do Sul, junto do Gustavo de Carvalho, que é outro parceiro nosso da REBRAPAZ. Então, para nós, isso é um motivo de muita alegria, de muita satisfação, muito orgulho poder ter construído esse programa junto com vocês e apresentar de novo isso, como eu falei, apresentar esse produto à sociedade brasileira. Por coincidência, Alcides, o dia de hoje, 10 de novembro, é o Dia Mundial da Ciência para a Paz e para o Desenvolvimento. Então, eu achei que foi muito apropriado a gente fazer justamente essa contribuição à ciência para a paz no dia de hoje, no dia 10 de novembro, né? E com isso, então, antes até de passar a palavra para o professor Alcides e encerrar a minha breve apresentação, breve abertura, né, vamos dizer, do Encontro Anual, eu queria só anunciar. A REBRAPAZ é a Rede Brasileira de Pesquisa sobre Operações de Paz. E uma decisão do Conselho de junho deste ano acabou concluindo que a gente poderia, como nós somos uma rede de ensino e pesquisa, e não só uma rede de pesquisa, concluímos, então, que vamos mudar o nome da rede. Então, a partir de 2023, a rede vai continuar REBRAPAZ, a sigla se mantém, mas o nome por extenso ela vai ficar sem pesquisa, vai ser uma rede brasileira sobre operações de paz, porque aí vai refletir, de fato, o braço da pesquisa, que foi bem ilustrado ontem, e o braço do ensino, da capacitação, do treinamento, né, do desenvolvimento de habilidades e competências, que é muito do que a REBRAPAZ também tem feito. Então, esse novo nome, a sigla se mantém de novo, volto a dizer, mas o novo nome, achamos, o Conselho Consultivo decidiu assim, vai refletir melhor esses dois pilares que hoje sustentam as atividades da nossa REBRAPAZ. Então, sem mais delongas, eu passo agora a palavra ao professor Alcides Costa Vaz, que está aqui do meu lado. Agradeço muitíssimo à Universidade de Brasília, ao Instituto de Relações Internacionais, ao GEPS em particular, pela condução desses trabalhos, hoje e ontem. É uma parceria com a qual nós temos muito orgulho de fortalecer, né, cujos laços a gente tem orgulho de fortalecer, e eu tenho certeza que o encontro de hoje e ontem e tudo o que virá depois disso vai só engrandecer a nossa REBRAPAZ e nos levar para um novo nível de conexão com a sociedade brasileira, com os tomadores de decisão, enfim, com toda a reflexão sobre operações de paz no Brasil e para onde queremos ir, para onde podemos ir, para onde devemos ir nos próximos anos. Professor Alcides, muito obrigado. Por favor, a palavra é sua. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado a você, Eduarda. Bom dia a todos, a todas. Dizer da nossa imensa alegria, da nossa satisfação em integrarmos a REBRAPAZ, sermos membros plenos da REBRAPAZ, e termos essa oportunidade de também nos associarmos à organização deste encontro, do seminário de pesquisa no dia de ontem, do encontro de hoje, particularmente num momento tão desafiador para o Brasil, em primeiro lugar, nesse momento de uma transição recém-iniciada, que toca diretamente também nas perspectivas das Forças Armadas brasileiras, do setor da defesa, da política externa brasileira, e nós sabemos que as operações de paz estão justamente na convergência, na confluência desses dois vetores, e estamos todos também, né, sob uma grande expectativa sobre o futuro, tanto imediato quanto mediato. Tá? O Brasil ocupa agora um assento rotativo no Conselho de Segurança, mas também sabemos que essas oportunidades sempre ensejaram no passado um incentivo, um estímulo e uma oportunidade ao engajamento em operações de paz. Olhamos para fora e vemos, né, como dizia o bom e velho James Rosenau, o mundo em turbulência, tá? O mundo em turbulência, com fortes apreensões com relação a todas as dificuldades que o multilateralismo enfrenta. Eduarda disse há pouco, tá? Dos exemplos e de um certo ceticismo que paira sobre as iniciativas multilaterais no campo da segurança, em outros domínios. Nós assistimos, né, a praticamente, vamos dizer, o estancamento ou uma crescente fragilização dos regimes internacionais na área de segurança, e não somente na área de segurança, se formos também a área comercial, a área ambiental, quer dizer, tudo aquilo com que nós lidamos, com que nós nos preocupamos, no que diz respeito à segurança internacional e particularmente com a dimensão da paz, está hoje sob uma pressão muito forte. E é nesse contexto, é nesse momento que nós temos essa oportunidade de nos reunirmos, de congregarmos também colegas de diferentes países, compartilhando essa mesma preocupação. E o tema central desse encontro e das mesas que temos ao longo do dia confirmam não somente a preocupação, mas a necessidade de que, enquanto comunidade epistêmica, nós também dialoguemos, nós também discutamos entre nós, para que também sejamos capazes de dar consequência à promoção de um debate político, de um debate social, para além dos próprios domínios acadêmicos. A rede tem essa preocupação com a formação, com a educação, com o engajamento de civis nas operações de paz. Quer dizer, é, portanto, um empreendimento de larga escala, eu diria que é uma iniciativa tão ambiciosa quanto necessária. E essas coisas se reforçam. E é o que nos traz aqui, é o que também nos motivou aqui no Instituto de Relações Internacionais, que nos motivou no nosso grupo de estudos sobre segurança e política internacional, o GEPSE, que há anos também vem militando, né, nesse campo da formação, da pesquisa, né, e encontramos essa oportunidade meses atrás, quer dizer, de travarmos de estabelecermos essa parceria, e aqui estamos. Aqui estamos. Eu quero desejar o maior êxito aos trabalhos desse dia. Estamos aqui trabalhando também, não somente torcendo, mas também trabalhando, empenhados para que assim seja. E, obviamente, agradecer em nome do GEPS, em nome do Instituto de Relações Internacionais, em nome dessa parceria com como REBRAPAZ, que, afinal de contas, também somos não apenas parceiros, mas partes, né, da REBRAPAZ, agradecer também a todos vocês de estarem presentes, de estarem somando esforços nesse mesmo sentido. Um ótimo trabalho a todos no decorrer do dia de hoje.
Muito obrigada, professor Alcides. Eu reforço também esse desejo, essa inspiração toda que nós tentamos trazer aqui. Nós temos certeza que isso vai acontecer ao longo do dia. Também realmente desejo que tenham todos um ótimo trabalho, que aproveitem esse espaço que tem sido criado anualmente pela REBRAPAZ para oxigenar as ideias aqui no Brasil sobre operações de paz. E com isso, eu passo a palavra agora, já vamos dar início, vou encerrar então essa pequena mesa de abertura, né, uma abertura um pouco mais protocolar, para reforçar principalmente a nossa parceria, mas também já queria dar início aos trabalhos propriamente dito, e o nosso primeiro painel, ele na verdade, o Keynote Speech, coordenado pelo nosso colega também da REBRAPAZ, Gustavo de Carvalho, que fala de hoje da África do Sul, e ele recebe o nosso amigo e muito admirado, o Cedric de Koning. Cedric, it is really a pleasure to be with you here today. I appreciate your time. I know you're going to share not only your knowledge, your experience, your time, and this is very inspiring for us.
Thank you very much, Eduarda and colleagues.
For being here with us today. Gustavo, the floor is yours. Thank you for that.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
So much, Eduarda.
Good luck.
Thank you, Alcides. This is really a pleasure to be here now, not only for having engaged with REBRAPAZ for the last years, but also for me, a very interesting partnership of having someone like Cedric speaking to us here, someone that we've worked together for a number of years. And Cedric certainly is one of the most prolific names within peace operations research, and certainly shares some fascinating inputs on this reflection around fragility and the future of peace operations, especially in the context of recent global changes. I think also personally for me, it's great to have this event being a partnership of REBRAPAZ, but also my own alma mater, the University of Brasília. So it's always great to interact in this particular space. So as Eduarda mentioned, so first of all, my apologies, I'm shifting now to English. We've agreed that the keynote speech would be in English. I see there is a number of colleagues that are now on YouTube following these discussions. So at any given time, if you would like to make any questions, make any comments, feel free to add those comments in there, either in English or in Portuguese. I would make sure I'll translate that to Cedric. But enough of this introduction. I just wanted to, in a way, just tell you who I am. I'm Gustavo de Carvalho. I've been an associate member of REBRAPAZ since February 2021. And I'm currently a senior researcher on the African Governance and Diplomacy program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and also a research fellow at the Institute for Pan-African Thoughts and Conversation at the University of Johanesburg. Cedric, our keynote speaker, as I mentioned, is one of the most prolific names and individuals working on peace operations research globally. So I'm sure there will be some fascinating insights from his side. Professor Cedric de Koning is a professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, also known as NUPI, and he's also a senior advisor at the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes. At the moment, I believe you're in South Africa doing your sabbatical at Stellenbosch University, so we are close to one another once again. And Cedric has been leading some really cutting-edge initiatives when it comes to the reflection and the policy support on peace operations, including through the Effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, EPON, that Cedric has been leading for a number of years, has been doing a lot of work with the United Nations, both in terms of peace operations, but also when it comes to peace building and other political dynamics of conflicts. And for us in the African continent, and his experience with the African Union and with regional responses to conflict certainly is something that would be very beneficial for this network and for the discussions that we'll be having. So how we're going to work now is just, I'll give the floor to Cedric to share some of his insights, and then we engage in a conversation and some questions, some answers. I'll be tracking the comments and questions from YouTube. But that being said, Cedric, please, maybe if you could share some of your thoughts around the future of peace operations and how is it being impacted by some of these major and recent changes in the global order. Thank you so much, Cedric.
Thank you very much, Gustavo, and it's an absolute pleasure to join you at this annual meeting. I know many of the colleagues in the call, we have been in touch over the years, and so an absolute pleasure to be part of this meeting and to engage and share some ideas with you. I'm going to talk about the fragility and future of UN peacekeeping operations in the context of a changing global order. So I will start by setting the context, discussing a little bit the changing global order and what its implications are for the future of UN peacekeeping operations. And then, of course, go more into those implications. So I think some of the key features of the changing global order is political, has to do with climate change, has to do with technology. So first of all, on the political side, I think when we are experiencing the turbulence that we are experiencing currently in the world, it's important to realize that we are just coming out of 75 plus years of a very unique moment maybe in world history, in the sense that we've had this unipolar era with one major superpower that have dominated the global governance for the last 75 plus years. And almost everything we know about international relations, the study of international relations, global governance, the United Nations, peacekeeping operations, all of this comes out of this last 75 years. And so we, our generation, come out of this very particular experience, and now we are facing something quite unprecedented. And so I think we almost need to go back to history before the 75 years to remind ourselves that this was probably a kind of a unique period, and that it certainly is not the normal if we look into the longer term history of the world. And therefore we need to look back at other experiences before this period to perhaps understand what we may face in the coming years. So we came out of a relatively peaceful and prosperous couple of decades, if you were in the West, compared at least to the first half of the 20th century with its two world wars and the various conflicts preceding that. But of course, a less peaceful period if you lived on the periphery of the Western order in Africa or in the Middle East or in Latin America. And I think this stability, the stable era of the unipolar era is changing now due to, on the one hand, the economic and to some degree political rise of China, but also because of the negative consequences of capitalism. So this unipolar era with its economic system and its political system, its liberalism, have worked for very many decades, but then over time, as with all systems, the negative elements starts to build up. And so we've seen a very significant inequality between the West and the rest in terms of access to political power globally, economically. We're going to talk more about the inequality in technology and so forth. But also, we've seen this economic system come with exploitation and exclusion of those of us on the periphery. And it also have come with the destruction of the environment and a major impact of climate. And so I think the combination of these factors is all working towards driving this change away from that unipolar era and driving us into something which we are uncertain exactly what it will be. There seems to be general consensus that it will be some form of multipolarity, where several great powers and many medium powers will compete, but also cooperate in a new era of a new type of global order. So the uncertainty of what is to come, the uncertainty of the implications of that in terms of peace and security and economic stability, this of course is and I think will remain for many decades to be the defining characteristic of the period that we're entering. So what we do know, although there's this uncertainty, what we do know is that many of the values and systems that was taken for granted in this period of the unipolar era will now have to compete on the global marketplace of ideas, on the global marketplace of norms and different systems. And so this, of course, has very specific implications for global governance, but also then for peacekeeping. And I think peacekeeping is a very interesting institution in practice to focus on, to as a way of looking at something very specific that can tell us more about the more general developments that we see. But let me say a few words about climate change. Of course, this is the greatest challenge of our time that will impact everything, including peacekeeping. It adds an additional pressure to this global order dynamics that I've just shared with you. One would, on the one hand, imagine that we have a common threat and that should stimulate more cooperation. But the solution to this common threat is the challenge around which there's a lot of different opinions, because it requires sacrifices in terms of our way of life, our economies, the welfare of our states and our peoples. And therefore, it's extremely difficult to negotiate in terms of who is going to make what kind of compromises, who will give up their common-based economy first, and what will be the consequences of that. Especially for developing countries, countries in Africa and elsewhere, there's major implications of, the fact that countries have coal, countries have gas, that they feel that is easier to develop in the short to medium term, and that they need that energy to develop their nations. And that if, because of global climate change, they are now prevented from using those resources to develop their nations, they are in fact delaying the development of their people for some greater good. And we've already had to delay the development of the people of our various countries because of global inequality and because of the political system that we discussed earlier. So this is a further sense of frustration. And I think one of the things we will see as a result is increased north-south, east-west tension as a result of the politics around climate change. And this will, of course, also have important implications for peacekeeping. And one thing I want to also highlight is that in addition to the direct and indirect consequences that climate change and environmental degradation have for conflict and peace, the transition that we are embarking upon in order to implement the Paris goals of changing our economies to a net zero carbon emissions by 2050 means that there will be major programs of transformation taking place. For instance, in South Africa, we have a major program to change our electricity generation that is mostly coal-based to renewable energy. It's a large international undertaking with about $8 billion of loans and grants. And of course, the question is, what's one thing, the technical side of it, but what will be the social implications? What will be the political implications? Will this strengthen and enhance current elites, those who are already rich? As you know, we have some of the largest inequalities in South Africa. Or will this transition actually help us to invest in social cohesion, into resilience and public trust, and change some of these inequalities? And I think this is a question for all countries, and it could lead to conflict and tension in many, many countries as well. So the transition itself is also a risk, in addition to the risks posed by climate change and environmental degradation. And then just a few short words on technology. Again, here we see that we already see the impact of new technologies, but there's the potential of significant changes in how we govern our economies with the introduction of artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies. And there's only a very few countries in the world that will be responsible, that have the capacity to generate those technologies and will therefore control those technologies. So this fast-paced introduction of new technologies, I think, will again further increase tension between North and South, between the countries that are more developed and those that are less developed, and will, in a sense, exacerbate the trends I spoke about in the context of climate change and the trends I spoke about in the context of the political global order. So what are the implications of all of these for peacekeeping? I think as we are moving into a more volatile world, the member states or the countries who are currently on this United Nations Security Council, but also other countries that are moving in the circles of being regional powers or countries that are more influential in the world, will generally be more risk adverse, will be more cautious during this period of volatility. And that means that they are likely to, or less likely to, agree on specific peace operations that have ambitious mandates, that are costly, especially since there's this uncertainty creeping in about, in the unipolar era, there was a very specific understanding of what the role of peacekeeping operations should be. But as this agreement, this kind of consensus that existed, at least in those countries that dominated the system, on the norms and values that the United Nations and peacekeeping operations should be using in their work and what their work should be, since that is now becoming more and more an issue of debate, less and less consensus. That means that when you have to negotiate a new resolution about a specific peacekeeping operation, that there's lots of tensions and in that process, and therefore people are less likely to attempt to introduce ambitious objectives and try to make those negotiations as uncontroversial as possible by reducing the content of what those missions should do to something that is non-threatening, that is technical, and so forth. I also think that there's a kind of a frustration with current peace operations, especially the kind of stability type of operations, which means that this plays into the reluctance to embark upon new operations. Right? There's this frustration that these kind of conflicts have failed, these kind of peace operations have failed to bring an end to conflicts. Many of these operations have been in there for decades. If we think about our mission in the Congo, that's been there since 1999-2000, but also many of the other operations, the African mission in Somalia, the mission in Mali, South Sudan, elsewhere. Also, there's regular incidents from time to time where the UN peacekeepers in these countries fail to protect civilians. And of course, we know that it is impossible for any peacekeeping operation to protect all civilians at all time. But still, these incidents of massacres, that happen close to UN peacekeeping bases and so on are reminders of the impotence of peacekeeping operations when it comes to being able to protect civilians at all time. And that builds a sense of frustration and even embarrassment, if you like, for some member states who have to address and explain these issues all the time. There's also other scandals like sexual exploitation and abuse. We've seen protests against the UN in the Congo and elsewhere, actually because the people in those countries want the UN to do more. In the case of the Congo, to challenge and defeat a rebel group called the M23, but in other countries to challenge and protect the state and the people against violent extremism. So overall, there's a reputational challenge in terms of the effectiveness of peace operations. I mean, in my view, UN peacekeeping operations have been very effective. And this has been supported also by the research evidence, have been very effective when they adhered to the principles of peacekeeping and when they were deployed to help to implement a ceasefire or a peace agreement. But since we shifted peacekeeping operations to a focus on protection of civilians and stabilization, in other words, from conflict resolution to conflict management, I think we placed peacekeeping operations in an almost impossible position where they don't have the political role to change the conflict, only the security responsible to manage the symptoms of the conflict. And that means that the peacekeeping operation themselves are not able to change the context within which they operate. They are just able to respond and adapt to the way the conflict manifests. And I think the UN Security Council is to blame for this, because these changes have come about through political expediency. The doctrine has never changed. It's just the practice and the way mandates have been given that have changed. And I think we also need to acknowledge a kind of a essential challenge with the concept of stability or stabilization operations. It assumes a legitimate government that is under threat from some aggressor, violent extremist or rebel groups, and therefore the UN comes to protect and help that legitimate government. But in most cases, the situation is not that clear. The legitimacy is precisely the reason for the conflict, because the legitimacy is in question. And the more you then stabilize the situation, the less incentive there is for the political elites that are currently in government to negotiate with others that may have valid grievances and may have valid claims of political inclusion, which they are being denied from. So I think we need to refocus peacekeeping on the political. But I just wanted to share that with you as a kind of a little digression. But the main point is that we see in this period of cautiousness and risk adverseness that there's a presumed concern about effectiveness and reputational loss with large peacekeeping operations, and also a concern about cost. So if you are in this uncertain period where there's already the general economic prospects are already bleak and uncertain, there's less likely to be agreement for to deploy peacekeeping operations with a large budget. And we can already see that since 2014, there's been no new peacekeeping operations that have been deployed. But as I mentioned before, I think there's also an issue around norms and values. We need to renegotiate, or we will need to renegotiate in this changing global order, what exactly is the role of the United Nations when it comes to intervening in conflicts? What is the appropriate role for the United Nations? And what should it do when it intervenes? Should it only provide security, or should it also help to rebuild the state? And if so, which norms and values, which systems should it promote? Currently, this is not on the formal agenda of being discussed. I mean, for instance, we just had a peacekeeping ministerial meeting in Seoul in December, and this kind of normative issues were not discussed there. There's still a lot of support for the current model, but I think it will be discussed more in future, and I think it is underlying the debate. It adds to the uncertainty, and it adds to a a second layer of discussions when it comes to Security Council resolutions and so forth. And as a result of these kind of uncertainties and mostly undebated and unarticulated differences, I would say we can already see a significant shift in the Security Council, how it deals with peacekeeping operations since 2014. As I mentioned, no new peacekeeping operations have been deployed, and all the operations that have been deployed, for instance, in Colombia, Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere, have been special political missions. In other words, smaller missions that do not include soldiers and police officers, at least in uniform in many of these operations. They come out of the General Assembly budget. They don't come out of the UN-assessed contribution budget, but they are much smaller and have less ambitious mandates. So therefore, they are less costly. There's less risk of failure. They don't, for instance, claim to or aim to protect civilians in a physical way. So if there is a loss of life as a result of the conflict, the missions are not blamed. The focus is more on the local political elites, which I think is actually a good thing, because if I compare, for instance, the United Nations mission in South Sudan with the UN mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, if there's a demonstration in the streets of Juba and the armed forces shoot on the protesters and a number of people are killed, in South Sudan, the debate will be about why hasn't the UN peacekeeping operation prevented that from happening. But if the same incident happens in Sudan, the debate is about the responsibility of the government of Sudan for stopping that from happening. And I think that is the right debate to have, not the debate about the role of the peacekeeping operations. We need to put the political focus on the political leads and political players in these countries. So in that sense, I think it's a good thing. There's also a less risk of reputational damage with special political missions, because in cases like sexual exploitation and abuse, because of course there's much less peacekeepers on the ground. It also means that there will be more outsourcing then when stronger security, physical security actions are necessary, more outsourcing to, for instance, African-led peace operations. But as I mentioned before, one of the challenges in this period is less willingness to spend large amounts of money on peacekeeping, and African peace operations will require financial support from the United Nations and others. So this creates a bit of a dilemma. If your theory of change is you're going to outsource that security to the African Union and others, but you're not willing to support that financially, that I think leads to some questions in terms of the coherence of the argument. In some cases, of course, there is a need for stabilization, or there is a need for security guarantees to help move a peace process forward. And if the United Nations is not playing that role, and if they are unable to support the African Union financially, then that leaves a vacuum, I think, for private military companies and other opportunistic countries. In our region, we, for instance, have currently and I think you will be very aware of it because it's a Lusophone country in Mozambique. We have an Islamic insurgency in the Cabo Delgado province. And there we have a deployment of the Southern African Development Community under the auspices of the African Union. But we also have a bilateral deployment of Rwanda. And it's a good example. Rwanda, it does not mean that the Rwandan forces are a private military company. It is a national state that is deploying in an agreement with Mozambique. But still, there's questions about what exactly is the mandate of that deployment. Who is funding that deployment, actually? In other words, what are the larger political interests behind that deployment? There's a lot of rumors that France is paying for that deployment because of its heavy investment in the LNG investments, deployments in that region. So all this creates questions and confusion. There's a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability. So the point is just that if the UN and the African Union, if the international organizations are not playing this role, it opens up a vacuum for others to fill that space, which can be quite problematic. So let me just conclude by saying we are entering a significant change in the global order, which will introduce a period of significant uncertainty. I think that will last for very many decades, if not for most of the 21st century. And that will create a certain context within which we have to manage international relations, global governance, and also peacekeeping operations. There's climate change, there's new technology, which will add further stresses to the situation. And then it has particular implications for peacekeeping operations. I mentioned that these operations are under increasing financial stress. There's questions about the principles, the doctrine, the purpose of these operations. But those big issues, the doctrinal issues, are unlikely to be resolved in a period of this uncertainty. And therefore, the ambiguity of even that dimension are likely to continue to be a defining characteristic of peacekeeping operations in the next couple of years. And then there seems to be a shift away, at least in the short and the medium term, to special political missions, maybe some of the older military observer missions, because they are seen as less intrusive, and they can be more useful in this period of uncertainty, as they were during the Cold War period, for instance. So overall, a period of uncertainty, also for peacekeeping operations, which will mean caution, moderation, conservatism. But at the same time, I think in the longer term, peacekeeping operations are likely to remain a feature, even with all this uncertainty and ambiguity, even with the shift to special political missions. Peacekeeping operations will remain as a part of the United Nations and as a part of global governance. And there will be particular moments when we turn back to peacekeeping in a particular crisis. And maybe eventually over time, peacekeeping will see a increased prominence again. And I say that also because when we look back just in the 75-year history I mentioned, we can also see periods where peacekeeping was very low in the international attention and there was little trust in it. And other times, peacekeeping was a very, very important instrument. So I think that fluctuation that we see is quite normal and is something we will continue to see in the coming decades as well. Let me stop there and back to you, Gustavo. Thank you very much.
Cedric, for that, and as expected, a really fascinating presentation and sharing some of the key trends that we see at the moment. And I wanted at this stage just to invite colleagues that are following us on YouTube and other platforms to share your questions. But while we wait for the participants to share these questions, I wanted to pick your thoughts on one issue that you mentioned quite often in your presentation, Cedric, that is the issue around transitions. And certainly in the last couple of years, we've seen a major conceptual push within international organizations to broaden the scope of peace operations as bringing together not just our traditional peacekeeping operations, but other tools that are related to that. And particularly when it comes to this understanding that in conflicts are not linear and the responses shouldn't be linear either. And in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of momentum regarding discussions on transitions. I think the case of Darfur, we saw transitions more traditional, like the one in Darfur, from a peacekeeping operation to a special political mission. But we've also seen a number of transitions that are occurring in more unusual spaces, like in the case of Guinea-Bissau, where you have a transition not from a peace operation to a special political mission, but from a special political mission towards the UN country team. And I think especially for a Brazilian audience, this is quite relevant at this stage, noting that one of the transitions that we spend most time in the last couple of years discussing in Haiti is already showing signs that this idea of success and being able to sustain the gains that we've seen during a peacekeeping operation seems to somehow be waning and to losing that description of effectiveness that we often talk about. So my question in that sense is just to get some of your thoughts and ideas regarding where do you see the role of transitions at this current moment, but particularly in transitions that touch So maybe Cedric, if you can one each question first, and then we open to the audience. Thanks, Cedric.
Thank you, Gustavo. There's two things I want to highlight in response to that question. The first is, I came into peacekeeping in around 1994, 92 to 94 as a young diplomat in Washington, D.C. And at that time, the major controversies at the time was the genocide in Rwanda, the peacekeeping operations in Somalia, where the US and the UN had to leave under threat of risk, and then shortly thereafter, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And at that time, the operations, those operations I described now, were mostly kind of military heavy operations. And in the decade that followed, the focus was on broadening these operations to be more multidimensional, to cover political and economic and reconciliation and justice issues and so forth. And there was an expectation over that next generation of peace operations that a UN peacekeeping operation would be the main agent of the international community to help a country in its transition from conflict to peace. But what we've seen, that on the one hand, that was very successful, in places like Namibia and Mozambique, Angola, Cambodia, El Salvador, Guatemala, where there was a peace agreement in place or a ceasefire agreement in place. So when the people in the conflict itself was at a point where they reached a point where they said, okay, we want to make peace, and where the United Nations helped them to make peace. But in those other places where the people were not convinced yet of peace, where some people, some strong actors wanted to continue to fight, and where the focus then shifted to protection of civilians and stabilization, where UN peacekeeping operations were deployed dealing with ongoing conflicts, what we see there in those cases is that the reality is a continuous operation. Because let's take Haiti as an example. No peacekeeping operation, will be able to bring an end to the conflict in 5 or 10 or even 15 years, and then everything will be peaceful after that. As long as we have the current state of weak governance and underdevelopment, right? So any operation there will be a continuous operation for many decades. So all what we see in reality is many different operations deploying one after the other in slightly different formats, focusing in on one or other issue. And the point I want to make there is that I think we're now at a point where we realize those operations can only perform a particular task, but it's more the role of the whole international community. So different parts of the UN system, different parts of the international system, the World Bank, the IMF, donors, particular countries, neighbors. So different parts of the international system that either work on the political dimension, on the governance dimension, on the development dimension, on the economic dimension. And then the question is, how do you coordinate all of that? How do you make sure that all those different actors are working towards a particular vision of what it is where that country wants to go? And I think that's the challenge of our time, is how to construct those coalitions not of countries in a force, but coalitions of the World Bank and the United Nations and the IMF and the European Union, and donors and neighbors and all interested countries that can play a role in helping to bring about the situation in Haiti, to change the situation in Haiti in a realistic time frame. What is the best possible, in an ideal world, how long will it take to help bring Haiti to some form of stability? That will probably require several decades, right? So we need a kind of a strategy that can survive and work over several decades together in a consortium or a coalition of people that want to bring that to place. So to put together that kind of coalition or consortium of actors, and then to manage that process over time, that I think is the new challenge of our time. And to understand then that peacekeeping is just one of the instruments in that larger coalition that perhaps play a particular set of roles in terms of security, stabilization, security sector reform, etc.
Thanks very much, Cedric. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue around that peace operations have a very specific task. I think the one thing that makes networks like REBRAPAZ very important is this: it's breaking some of the preconceptions that exist even within the field, that one actor, one player can have the solutions for everything. And I think what I take from your comments is this idea that peacekeeping is not a panacea. It's not going to really resolve all of the challenges on the ground, and certainly requires a coordinated approach if we want to maintain this idea that peace operations occur in a political space, and the centrality of politics has an impact not only in terms of how do we deploy personnel to the ground, but particularly how do we design those solutions. So thanks very much for that. We have a couple of comments here from the audience. So I'm just gonna bring Eduarda's comments all together, and then we have Eduarda from REBRAPAZ, and we have also Sergio Aguilar from the State University of São Paulo with one question. So Eduarda asks a very important question, and particularly, what does it all mean for a country like Brazil? And I think the context that Eduarda has placed in here is particularly important, considering that we're talking about being a relevant player from the Global South, and historically being part of a number of different modalities of peace operations, whether it's with its own experience in Haiti, but also the engagements with MONUSCO in the DRC that you mentioned previously, and the different dynamics and nature of that. But at a more strategic level, countries like Brazil, being part of the UN Security Council and being part of a lot of the decision-making when it comes to the mandating of those peace operations, but also being quite an active member in organs like the C-34 of the General Assembly, and a lot of those discussions around that. So it seems to me, and maybe I'm extrapolating a little bit on the question that Eduarda asked, is that it seems to be a trend with a lot of emerging powers, and that idea of the commitment gap that we often talk about, where developing countries tend to be the ones that are deploying troops and developed countries are the ones paying. For a number of years, we would include middle powers like Brazil or South Africa or Turkey within the list, but we've also seen in the last 7 years many of these countries reducing their participation, with Brazil with a very small presence now on the ground. We have South Africa, which for years with a very reduced contingents and mostly based in the DRC, and now recently increased a little bit based on what is happening here in the region. So it would be, I think the first question would be great to hear more from you in terms of what is in it for emerging powers like Brazil, and what can we expect on that, and how do we make sure there is a continued one. Sergio asks a question about, which I think is also very timely.
Let me take Eduardo's questions separate.
Sure.
No worries. Quickly. I think there's many different reasons why countries deploy and participate in peacekeeping operations, especially emerging power, regional powers like Brazil. I think the first could be to manage a regional conflict, a conflict where the country has a direct interest, or at least in its neighborhoods, which is, I think, why Brazil has played such a prominent role in Haiti, for example. Another one could be to demonstrate its ability to project itself through soft and hard power, somewhere fairly distant. And that can be done in ways where you have some form of comparative advantage. So again, I think Brazil in particular played a role in Lusophone countries, but also in other places. And sometimes an important consideration is, for instance, a strategic partner. So let's say China has a particular interest in the conflict in Sudan, and Brazil wants to have show a particular sympathy or empathy or solidarity with China in that context, and then deploy there in support of or alongside other. So those could be all some of the different considerations which a country like Brazil can use or consider. And I don't think any one of those or all of those are true all of the time. The interests differ, but these are, if we look historically, these are the different reasons and considerations that countries have why they deploy. I think in terms of the transitions we just discussed, the role of civilian experts and police experts are also coming to the fore. And if we talk about special political missions, especially if that's going to be a major feature of peace operations in the coming decades, then having specialized teams, especially in areas of justice, police, governance, security sector reform, local governance, regional governance, elections, reconciliation. These are all areas where I think you could have civilian experts which you could offer to the United Nations as a team or as individuals. And if you know, as individuals, the country is not so prominent. But what I see many countries do is they build up a team of 10 justice experts, lawyers, magistrates, etc., and then offer that team to the United Nations. And that's a way in which the identity, the national identity of the team then still plays the same kind of role that you get from deploying a team of police or a team of soldiers.
No, thanks very much. And maybe let me just quickly jump to Eduarda's second question. Sergio, I haven't forgotten yours. I think it's very important, but I just think that Eduarda's question fits in nicely to what you were saying, Cedric. But we've seen in the last over a decade already a number of different processes within the UN to strengthen the civilian role within peace and security, and with different results. I think many of us would remember the review of 2010s, and many of these processes somehow faded into oblivion to some extent, and kind of we lost a bit of interest around that, and partially with the difficulties of dealing with. Maybe if you could just briefly reflect on what should be the current conversations regarding civilian expertise within peace and conflict issues.
I think what we saw...
Yeah, please go ahead, Cedric.
I think what we saw in that context is that there was this initiative, as you say, around civilian capacity. But the mistake the UN did at that time was to not look at its own human resources system, but only look at international expertise and how it could somehow leverage that expertise. There is, of course, many individual Brazilians deployed in various UN agencies, and including peacekeeping operations. And I think that will continue, and it is good for any country, including Brazil, to generate individuals like that. But as I mentioned before, if you want to have an impact as a country, if you want the deployment to have a national identity, then it's more impactful if you deploy a team. And this is normally what they call governance deployed experts or something like that. So it's the government of Brazil that offers to the United Nations, in a particular context where that is needed, 10 legal professionals, magistrates or prosecutors or special investigators that can then help that mission in that particular place to deal with an investigation. But you have a team of 10 or more Brazilians that are deployed into that particular space. Probably the Lusophone element would be critical in that kind of deployment. And then you get that same national identity. We'll talk about the Brazilian team, and you get the same national identity that you get from the other. So I think that's the kind of, from a governmental perspective, that's the kind of capacity that a country like Brazil could invest in.
No, thanks very much. And kind of jumping into Sergio's question, which I think are quite important in a period where we've been talking a lot about the idea of these Christmas tree mandates, where peace operations have a really large number of mandated tasks, which of course it becomes quite difficult for them to do. But one trend in the last couple of years has been this issue around prioritizing and sequencing of mandates. And Sergio asks whether this could be an option for unrealistic, and I add maybe realistic mandates, and what are some of the challenges of planning? And I'm using that expression particularly because I know it was your PhD topic. How do you plan to prioritize things in spaces where everything is a priority, but also within this idea of complexity, and how complexity actually has an impact on the ability of peace operations to deal with sequenced mandates, to prioritize mandates, but ultimately that they reach those benchmarks and ideas of what success would look like?
Yeah, I think the idea with sequent mandates coming out of the high-level panel on peace operations, was this recognition that we will never get it right in the beginning. Right? In the beginning, when there's a need for a new mission, we normally send out some kind of an assessment mission. They come back and they make a proposal, and then based on that initial proposal, the Security Council deploys a peacekeeping operation. And what we've seen in the past is that then leads to a kind of a path dependency. The objectives of that mission is kind of locked in. And even although on the ground, after a couple of months, or you realize that there were some serious gaps in that assessment, but then to get additional elements in the mandate or to enlarge the mission or to get different capacities is very difficult once that's locked in. And so the idea of sequence mandates was partly to say that, let's recognize that in the beginning, we're not going to have all the information. Once we're on the ground, we're going to have much better information. So the first mandate should be quite broad. And then we should anticipate that there will be changes and adaptations and improvements and refinements in the mandate going forward. And I think that's a very good recognition, and also an acceptance that these conflicts change. The conflict in the Congo today is not at all the same conflict that the mission was deployed to deal with 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So we have to recognize that the conflicts themselves also change and therefore need significant continuous ability to adapt. So that kind of recognition of the complex environments we're in, the uncertainty, the recognizing our inability to fully understand those situations, which all of that basically requires a much higher acceptance of flexibility and adaptation in our planning and management of these operations.
No, thanks very much. And Eduarda made a comment here, which I think is quite important, reflecting on the underrepresentation of countries like Brazil when it comes to civilian. She mentions here that there's over 13,000 civilians deployed within UN peace operations, and only 40 of them are Brazilian. So I think it does show that importance of, I think, first to create motivations for nationals to be able to apply for positions. That I think there is often this misconception, at least for colleagues that tend to work with the more uniform personnel type of deployment, and how to create that incentive, but also the country nationally to be able to create ideas and so on. And we've seen in a lot of countries in Europe, in Africa, and developing some of those more sophisticated narratives on how their nationals can be part of that. But I wanted to briefly switch the conversation a little bit and bring what you were mentioning earlier about the current context where those operations are deployed. And I think it's something that would be useful for us to discuss a bit further, because we're talking about, and I think you bring quite a strong argument of the fact that we haven't had any new UN, and I'm deliberately highlighting UN here, peace operations since 2014, because at the same time we saw this mushrooming of alternative deployment styles, which don't always fit within this idea of what peace operations traditionally would be. And I'm directly thinking of the idea of ad hoc security initiatives, where there is G5 Sahel, where there is MNJTF, and all of those in kind of Central West Africa, are kind of exploiting this gaps and loopholes that we have within this kind of global governance space. So my question in that sense is, how do you see this constantly ever-changing, emerging division of labor between different international organizations? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities, especially for researchers and practitioners working in a country like Brazil, when they're reflecting on the future of peace operations, in line not only what is happening within the United Nations, but also noticing that the UN does not work in a vacuum. They're still going to have their mission in a country like Mali that is working very close to a regional coalition that kind of may or may not be fitted within peace operations idea. So that would be my question.
I don't know if in Brazil you make a distinction between peacekeeping operations and peace operations, but there's in Portuguese I should say, but there's been no new peacekeeping operations since 2014. But there has been peace operations, meaning special political missions and other forms of operations deployed. Right? So a peacekeeping operation is where you have the blue helmets deployed, large military contingent, but also police and civilian. whereas another form of peace operation could be a special political mission like the one you mentioned in Guinea-Bissau, which is more like a political office, but with a mandate from the Security Council to perform specific tasks. And that operation in particular, I visited that mission as well, and it was interesting to see how many police officers there were in uniform in that operation, and even military advisors. I think to answer your question, I would say that we need to recognize that we started this concept with peacekeeping operations, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and our main idea in our mind is, the large UN peacekeeping operations in the Congo, but in reality, we've seen a larger spectrum develop. There's many more types of operations today than just those big multinational peacekeeping operations. You have small political operations. You can have just a police operation. You can have an operation to deal with Ebola, or an operation to deal with COVID-19. You can have an operation that deploys to support a humanitarian assistance mission or a natural disaster. So the spectrum of possibilities is much greater than what we anticipated before. And the players are many more. So it's not just the United Nations, but we have the European Union, we have the African Union, we have coalitions of the willing, and various sub-regional and other actors that from time to time may be called upon to deploy a peace operation. So I think what we as researchers and what diplomats and countries and ministries of defense need to do is to understand this much broader concept of peace operations and be in their imagination of what a country like Brazil could contribute. We can be much more innovative in coming with ideas. Anything is possible in today's world. We don't have to follow a particular model. Brazil can innovate a new idea, come up with a suggestion of, some form of operation that can address a particular challenge in the region or so forth. So if one thinks of Haiti, for instance, and you have to think differently, not if you don't want to deploy a traditional peacekeeping operation, but some form of regional mission that involves several countries from the region under UN auspices or not. What would such a mission look like? What kind of capacities do you need? So I think there's a much greater opportunity for innovation, for creativity. The core idea is, we come together as a couple of countries or organizations that have a shared interest in helping to resolve this problem. We identify what the problem is, we put our capacities together, and we deploy an operation. And as we mentioned earlier, we need to understand that that operation is one tool in a larger holistic approach to deal with that problem. Others will help with the economic side of things, or development, or justice, and so on. And so you need to understand your particular niche in that context, and then work with the others to bring about your change. But that would be, my call is for a very broad understanding of a spectrum of potential peace operations.
Thanks, Cedric. And we only have like 2 minutes left, and I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I just wanted to ask you a final question, and particularly at the political level, and you spoke earlier about the divide within the UN Security Council. We've seen since 2014 one of the most complicated spaces of assessing the effectiveness of the UN Security Council, and that has had a direct impact on how peace operations are then seen. And I think you mentioned the issues around budgets, there's issues around politics and division of perspectives of what the UN should be doing. What are some of your thoughts on what is coming ahead of us in terms of the war in Ukraine? And we've seen already some impact on some peace operations on the ground, and especially where we have private military corporations from Russia deploying in places like Sudan or Mali or Central African Republic, and the spillover effects that it creates on negotiation or with a few African member states. And I think Ethiopia probably the most visible of them on this. on how positions on issues related to this global geostrategic issues like Ukraine or North Korea can have a spillover effect on issues that are important for them. So how do you see the role that the Security Council will be playing in the coming years? And particularly, and I think despite we're talking about reforms and the importance of reforms, but the role that the E10 and the to assist.
Yes, no, I lost you for a moment there, Gustavo, but I think I got your question. One of the interesting things you mentioned, the effectiveness of peace operations network in the introduction, and I would say one of the most interesting things we identified in the work of the process is to realize that very often one of the major factors determining the success of a peace operation is the degree to which there's a coherent political understanding of what the mission should achieve in the Security Council, but also amongst neighbors and other key actors and so on. When there's a great deal of coherence at a particular moment, the mission can achieve a lot. So for instance, when everybody wanted the mission in the Congo to act strongly against the M23 movement, right? The mission could do things that we thought no peacekeeping mission could ever do. But at most other times, that level of coherence doesn't exist. And so it was interesting to see that, for instance, currently in the Congo as another example with a new M23 challenge, there's this expectation that the mission should somehow solve the problem, but the problem needs to be solved between, the government of the Congo and the government of Rwanda at the highest levels. It's a diplomatic problem. It's a political problem. The mission can just deal with the symptoms of it on the ground. And I think understanding which issues need to be resolved diplomatically at the Security Council or other diplomatic levels, and which issues are realistic for a peacekeeping operation to achieve is an important understanding that we need to develop and improve in our kind of assessment of the effectiveness of peace operations. I know we're running out of time, so let me stop there. I know I haven't answered all of your questions.
No, thank you so much for that, Cedric, and thanks, Eduarda, Alcides, REBRAPAZ, University of Brasília, for this opportunity and for what for me was a fascinating discussion. And thank you first, Cedric, for really once again sharing a really strong analysis about what are some of the current challenges and opportunities for peace operations. And I really feel that we start these events on a very high note. So thank you very much, Cedric. Thank you for all of the participants for your questions, for your comments. We are going now into a brief 15 minutes break. And after that, we will start with the following section. And maybe I see Eduarda in there. So maybe, but thank you very much. And looking forward to seeing the other discussions. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. Thank you very much, everyone.